Hello everyone, my name's Matthew Martin and I'm a lecturer in Art History and Curatorship at the University of Melbourne. Prior to joining the university at the beginning of 2019, I spent 13 years as a curator working with the Decorative Arts collection of the National Gallery of Victoria. My work as an art historian and as a curator has frequently focused upon artworks and elements of visual culture that fall outside the traditional academic canons of the fine arts. That's the lot of the specialist in the so-called decorative arts. You study and work with what has traditionally been deemed a lesser form of art, whether the term employed is decorative art, applied art, minor art. The qualifier applied to the word art suggests that the material being considered is of a lesser order of significance than, for example, the works produced by the disciplines of painting and sculpture, which have formed the foundations of modern Western art history and criticism since the 18th century. Many examples of the decorative arts are also closely allied with the category of craftwork, modes of making that are often strongly associated with domestic contexts, distant from the public arenas of political and social power, and thus again, works deemed to be incapable of communicating morally and intellectually significant content, a key aspect of the traditional academic definitions of art. But I've always been interested by the window onto alternative social narratives and identities, distinct from those promulgated by the political and cultural establishment that these lesser decorative arts often provide us. So, for example, in 2013, I curated an exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria, Kings Over the Water, drawing upon that institution's extensive and internationally significant holdings of Jacobite glass. Now, this is a category of artefact that largely consists of 18th century London manufactured drinking glasses engraved with innocuous seeming floral decoration that in fact carried encoded expressions of political loyalty to the Stuart kings of Britain, who'd been overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and who in the first half of the 18th century plotted their return from exile to reclaim their British thrones. Bonnie Prince Charlie and the uprising of 1745 is perhaps the best known incident in this long-running political saga. And if you've watched the series Outlander on Netflix, you'll probably be familiar with the Jacobites and their political machinations. For me, the interest of Jacobite glass is the way in which carefully considered decoration turns everyday utilitarian objects available to middle classes and elites, drinking glasses, into expressions of a particular corporate identity. The act of drinking wine in company, an essential aspect of mid-18th century British sociability, is transformed by the use of these glasses into a subversive, treasonous political act. This social agency of the artwork is something that is often so much more pronounced with decorative arts, far more so than with a painting or a sculpture, for example, because of the utilitarian dimension that these artworks so often possess. They are embedded in the rituals of people's everyday lives. And that brings me to the artwork from the collections of the Ian Potter Museum that I want to talk about today. A needlework sampler depicting a map of the counties of England and Wales, framed by a wreath of English flowers. The work's executed in silk thread on a silk satin ground and bears the date 1794 and the initials BA for Beatrice Acton, the embroiderer of this image. Beatrice Acton was niece of Sir Richard Acton of Aldenham Hall in Shropshire, so her background is that of the gentry and lesser aristocracy. She was born in 1780. That makes her around 14 in 1794 when she embroidered this map. Beatrice's social class is reflected in the relative richness of the materials used to execute this embroidery, the silk threads and the silk ground. Now, this object is an example of a type of artefact that was rarely collected by non-specialist museums. And indeed, this example entered the Potter Museum as part of the Russell and Mab Grimwade bequest in 1973. So it came in as part of a larger bequest of artworks. It's something that would have traditionally been classified as craftwork. The embroidery is a product of work pursued in a domestic context by a young woman. There's often, of course, a highly gendered aspect to definitions of craftwork. Indeed, embroidery was in the past considered a key element of the so-called womanly arts. Needlework had been an important part of the education of young women from the upper echelons of European society since the medieval period. The ability to embellish the textiles that were such an important part of the furnishings of a home in the early modern period was seen as an essential skill for a young woman who, upon getting married, took up the government of a household. In 18th century England, the period of the production of this work, a girl would be taught how to embroider from as young an age as 6. Needlework formed part of the female accomplishments at this period. So these included, besides embroidery, reading and writing, playing a musical instrument, usually the keyboard, dancing and drawing and painting. So these were considered the essential skills and were the core of the education offered to young women. And needlework education often involved the creation of samplers. So these were needlework exercises that involved the demonstration of mastery of a variety of stitch types, whilst also practicing the alphabet. They could also sometimes function as reference tools, allowing an embroiderer to remind themselves of particular stitch patterns. So the example that I'm showing you here by Mary Wilson, again from the Potter Museum collection, although dated much later, 1871, and employing much humbler materials than Beatrice Acton's sampler, gives a sense of this type of object. And we can see here the pedagogical role needlework could assume. Here, both the art of decorative embroidery and the art of letters are being practiced simultaneously. So there's an intimate connection here between needlework and literacy. It was during the period between about 1770 and 1840 that the so-called maps samplers, like the Potter example by Beatrice Acton, gained popularity. Instead of letters, stitch samples and decorative pictorial motifs, these samplers were built around maps. Most commonly, they were county maps of England, to slightly less frequently Scotland and Ireland, but maps of the hemispheres of the globe were also executed. The phenomenon of the map sampler was largely restricted to Britain and to the United States, the former English colonies there. The events of the late 18th and early 19th centuries stimulated an explosion of interest in geography. The American and French revolutions, the wars between France and England, the War of 1812, Captain Cook's voyages, and the explorations of Lewis and Clark in the United States made the study of geography fashionable. For British women, publications aimed specifically at them, such as the Ladies' Magazine or Entertaining Companion for the Fair Sex, which was a monthly magazine published between 1770 and 1847. This publication included condensed accounts of contemporary exploratory missions and accounts of new global discoveries, as well as the expected articles on society, fashion, and fiction. Geography also began to assume an important new role in formal education. Geography was in fact one of the first sciences to be included in the curriculum taught to girls in schools. Now, the historian of cartography, Judith Tyner, has suggested that the rise of the map sampler reflects a transition in women's education away from the ladies' accomplishments of the 18th century to the geographic education and map drawing current in schools and academies of the second half of the 19th century. Needlework and the needlework sampler traditional mode of women's education began to be used as a means of providing young women with a geographical education. Embroidering the outlines of a map and filling in place names facilitated memorization of this knowledge. Map publishers, in fact, catered to this new mode of learning. So, for example, Laurie and Whittle of Fleet Street in London produced maps of England, Scotland and Ireland intended for this new needlework market. Maps were either printed directly onto silk for embroidering or as a fine paper template, which was laid onto a fabric ground, generally of silk, and then stitched through. But Tyner's account of the role of map samplers in young women's education perhaps attributes too passive a role to the stitcher. Essentially, the production of the samplers is presented as a mechanical process of copying a printed model. Historian Susan Fry, in her 2013 book, Pens and Needles, by contrast, argues that needlework in the early modern English context functioned as an important women's literacy. The choice of subject matter, the combination of different motifs in an embroidery work, all of this provided women with an avenue to express personal, political and religious convictions in both the domestic sphere, where the needlework was executed, and beyond, when needlework objects were given as gifts, in a way that was not necessarily open to them in male-dominated forums like printed material. A mid-17th century English embroidered and couched panel in the National Gallery of Victoria illustrates this idea. The panel depicts King Charles I of England, Scotland and Ireland, and his queen, Henrietta Maria of France. Surrounded by an assortment of floral, architectural and animal motifs, the royal couple are shown standing beneath a canopy of state. Charles I was executed in 1649 during the English Civil War, and details of this embroidered image indicate that it was probably composed after this date, following the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the English Commonwealth. In particular, the king is depicted having laid down his sword and his orb on the empty armchair behind him. If we look to the top of the panel, in the sky directly above the figure of the king, the sun is obscured by a cloud. At the king's feet, a dog gnaws upon a bone. All of these iconographic details suggest here that the king is dead, that this is a post-execution image. But interestingly, the Queen, Henrietta Maria, who had fled to France in 1644 at the height of the First Civil War, is depicted, like her husband, bearing a sceptre. The implication of this image is that Henrietta Maria is a regnant or reigning queen. In other words, this embroidered panel is no mere decorative object. It's a highly politically charged image. Its maker is clearly expressing royalist sympathies in a period when Parliament and the Commonwealth rule in England. So we have here in this embroidered picture a direct insight into the political beliefs of a mid-17th century elite English woman. And I think that this tradition of needlework as a mode of self-expression for English women needs to be borne in mind when we look at map samplers of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Yes, in general, these are probably the work of young students, but it's still the case that choices were made by the embroiderer in creating these works, in deciding upon the subject that they depicted. And so they have the potential to give us insight into individual thoughts and experiences. Now, map samplers like Beatrice Acton's focused upon the geography of the single kingdom of Great Britain, here England plus the Principality of Wales, make up the bulk of surviving examples of these types of embroidery work. But other samplers exist that depict hemispherical maps of the world. An example of this type of sampler is to be found in the collections of the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. Embroidered by Anne Margaret Hammond in 1812, this sampler shows a double hemisphere map of the world, probably based upon a Laurie and Whittle map, again, published in London in 1794. Interestingly, the embroidery here includes the tracks of Captain Cook's first voyage to the Pacific of 1768 to 1771. Now we can see here, if we compare Beatrice Acton's sampler and the sampler by Anne Hammond, a distinction in these two works between political geography, the Acton sampler, the depiction of England and its counties, and physical geography, Hammond's global map. But also perceptible here, I think, is an engagement with ideas around national identity and imperial ideologies. Hammond's map evidences knowledge of Cook's voyages of exploration and engagement with British imperial aspirations at the end of the 18th century. Lines of silk stitches encompass the hemispheres of the globe in an imperial web centred upon England that projected claims of territorial control and scientific dominance. In creating samplers like these, young women were performing public cartography. They were rehearsing cartographic knowledge outside of the formal structures of academia and government. In the making of these artworks, they were being equipped with the knowledge and vocabulary to engage in discourse around national identities and imperial aspirations in the age of the Industrial Revolution. The practice of embroidering map samplers came to an end in the middle years of the 19th century, when the significance of needlework in general in education began to change. With the invention of sewing machines, learning to hand stitch was no longer perceived to hold such practical importance. The mid-19th century also saw steel pens and pencils replace slate boards in classrooms, and so providing a permanent alternative to stitched drawings in thread. But on top of all this, the increasing use of globes and the availability of cheaper printed geographical maps and atlases contributed to a decline in the fashion for embroidered maps in the classroom or in teaching situations. And indeed, progressive educators began to challenge the traditional education of women in general, and embroidery began to be considered something of a waste of time. It was deemed that there were far more practical and significant knowledges that young women needed to acquire in order to be able to function in the modern world. Now, this latter development especially must have contributed greatly to the relegation of embroidered work to the realm of women's domestic craft, its exclusion from the category of art and artworks. If embroideries continued to be valued at all, frequently it was as a keepsake of the maker and not for their standing as artworks in their own right. So, for example, the Acton sampler came to Australia when Beatrice's son emigrated to the colonies in 1846, bringing this and other heirlooms with him as a reminder of a family heritage in the mother country. But for a brief period at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, embroideries like this provided a window into a significant moment in shifting pedagogical attitudes towards women's education in Britain. And they provide us with glimpses of young women's engagement in some of the key political developments of their day, especially Britain's growing imperial aspirations, the legacy of which here in Australia confronts us every day.